We are for the church and for the kingdom. This vision drives everything we do. There are many noble causes and institutions in this world, and we care about the future of seminaries, academies, governments, social causes, and parachurch ministries, but they are not fundamentally why we exist. We exist for the future of the church and the advancement of God's kingdom. With God's help, our students today will be the pastors, ministers, and missionaries of the global church tomorrow. We teach the Bible in the classroom so that generations of churches will be sturdy outposts of Christ's kingdom. This is how we serve the church, and this is how we bless every other good and noble endeavor until God's glory covers the earth like the waters cover the sea. Will you join us?
Thank you very much, Dr. Allen, for your welcome. Thank you very much, Midwestern. It's great to see you. Good morning. And do please open your Bibles because we're going to have some time camping out around Luke 15 and looking at this wonderful section. Some people see it as a central section in Luke's gospel, particularly looking at the story of the two sons, which is Jesus' longest story. It's all of 388 words long, 3 minutes long, very long. A lot of time when people think about stories, they think of long stories like, Tolkien, like how long's Tolkien? It just goes out on and on, doesn't it? Jesus can do a whole load in just 3 minutes, which is so striking. So we're going to start by reading this passage, Luke chapter 15. This is God's word. Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I found my sheep that was lost.' Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Or what woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? And when she's found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost.' Just so, I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents." And he said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that's coming to me.' And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his field to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let's eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now, his oldest son was in the field, and as he came near and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound.' But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he said to his father, "Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that's mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad. For this, your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Picture the scene. There are 4 groups of people listening to this story if we exclude the disciples for a moment. We have tax collectors, sinners, scribes, and Pharisees. And we can really divide those 4 groups into 2 categories. Tax collectors and sinners on the one hand, and scribes and Pharisees on the other. Tax collectors and sinners are every single tax collector, all the sinners, drawing near to hear Jesus. Here is the thing that Israel is commanded every day. "Hear, O Lord, the Lord your God is one." It's the Deuteronomy 6 verse 4. That's what they're doing. The tax collectors are doing it. The sinners are doing it. And then who's grumbling? And who grumbles in the Bible? It's Israel in the Old Testament, isn't it? Who we got doing that? That's the scribes and Pharisees. Let's think about those categories. Tax collectors. They're people who take money. You knew that. You didn't need me to come and tell you that. But they take the money you were about to donate to the Jerusalem temple, weren't you? And they take that and they give that and they take that and give it over to Rome Incorporated in order to hire some soldiers to oppress you. So do you like them? No, you don't. They're really bad. That's very bad. That's very anti-God, what they're doing. Okay. Sinners. Now, everyone's a sinner. We get that. But these are classy sinners. This is what their identity. They must be in some flagrant breach, either of Old Testament law or of the rules that people added to that. And so you don't expect either of those groups to know anything about the Bible. And then we have these other 2 groups, Pharisees. They are the polar opposite of sinners. A Pharisee means a separator. It's a sort of Aramaic passive participle. And that's what gives you that they separate. Now, the problem with that, about separating from sin, it's a bit like trying to run away from your shadow because it follows you round. Sin is within. It's not just what comes from without, which defiles you. What comes from within that defiles you, as Jesus teaches. So that's a problem for Pharisees, but they're trying hard to get away from sin. They're the polar opposite of sinners who are in flagrant breach of rules. They're trying to keep the rules. And then they've got scribes. And they're people whose job it is to do, well, various things. They could write a contract for you if you need to buy something, like a field. But they also spend a lot of their time copying out the Bible, particularly the first 5 books, which are super popular. And so they know those really well. And so what Jesus does, he's going to tell a story which will work with all of these groups simultaneously. And that's a striking thing. We're going to see particularly tomorrow how what he speaks says a lot to the scribes and Pharisees based on the sorts of things they would know about. This is an amazing thing. But they're grumbling that Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners, eating with them, that he's, if you like, feasting with them, celebrating, and he tells them this parable. Notice it's a singular in verse 3. 1 parable in 3 stories, okay? So 3 stories. I sometimes talk about the parable of the prodigal son. I try to correct myself and say it's the story of the prodigal son. It's the parable is all 3. And he begins with these 2 things that I'll call warm-up stories. They're big stories in their own right. And they're questions. What man does this? What woman does that? Before we get on to a story which is not posed as a question. And there are some structural differences you can see between the stories because, for instance, in the first 2, the person goes and searches for what is lost. And in the final story, the father doesn't go into the far country running after the son. And I think there's a very interesting balance there in that what's going on, speaking about human responsibility and God's sovereignty in a really beautiful way. Parable, of course, can mean riddle and puzzle. And so one of the things that we're given with this 3-fold story is a mind teaser. And you can spend your entire life thinking about this riddle and going deeper with it, and you will see so many things. So in these first two stories, we have 1% of the sheep going astray, don't we? 1 out of 100. And it goes astray, it goes away from home, it's found, and then there's rejoicing. Then we have 10% of the coins, 1 out of 10, but it's lost at home and it's found, and then there's rejoicing. Then we have a story of a son who goes away from home and he comes back and there's rejoicing. Then we have a story of a son who stayed at home the whole time, and then we have a missing ending. Notice how we never get to hear what happens with the older son. The last thing we hear is the father addressing him, and it's almost like it ends with a question mark or an invitation. How is that older son going to respond? Is he going to come in which case we know how to fill in the ending because of Sudoku. We use the Sudoku hermeneutics. It's a school of hermeneutics. And what that enables us to do is use the numbers we already have to fill in what we don't have. We know 1% lost, 10% lost. Maybe the next number is going to be 100. In other words, although it never says that older brother is lost, there are actually 2 lost sons in that last part of the story. And we know that there's rejoicing about the younger son when he comes back. We know it would be wonderful if that older son would come in. But there's that question, does he walk away or does he not? And that's part of the brilliance of the way Jesus tells a story, in that he can do something by missing out an ending and making you think about that riddle. Now, with the first 2 stories, we have a slight issue with grammar, because we see these stories grammatically as divided into 2. They begin with a question, what man of you, addressing men, though women can be sinners as well, but addressing men, and then what woman. You see the slight difference between that what man of you versus what woman. And they begin with a question in our English translations, and then we see them as having started off with a question, then continuing a story which is a statement. You see that? Now remember, the question mark wasn't around at the time of Luke's gospel, not as something in the way it is now. It's not that no one had thought of question marks, but it was never a compulsory thing. What happened is at first question marks are optional in order to mark something you really want to show as a question. They think the earliest question mark anyone's found is 5th century AD in a manuscript. But then they become compulsory things that you have to put them. And so by at least the 13th century, we see people having a question mark in Middle English translations of this parable. Maybe they can even go earlier. And so what that means is, or this story, that you divide in our grammar between a question bit and a statement bit of each of these 2 stories. But that's not what Jesus was doing. So we might want to say either it's all questions, so we have 1 question mark at the end of verse 6. That would be tough for us in English. We really wouldn't like to do that. Or we could have lots of question marks going all the way through. Which man doesn't? Because otherwise you end up thinking, he's really saying, isn't it quite normal to leave 99 sheep and go after the 1? That's the 1 bit, and people have a puzzle about the culture it would have been. Would someone have left sheep? No, you don't leave sheep unattended. That's clear from 1 Samuel chapter 17, where big brother Eliab says to David, who will you leave those few sheep with? And it actually has told you he left them with a keeper. You can't, a narrator can't assume that everyone's going to think that way. But if you take the whole lot as a question, you realize it's a bit of a strange question. Because it's one of those ways that Jesus shocks us with his storytelling by, who doesn't have a sheep finding party? Who does? Who doesn't have a coin finding party? Who does? You know? Whereas if you just isolate that first bit, you wonder whether it might be part of the culture you'd leave the sheep, right? So that's just something as not the main point here, but just to realize the problems of questions in Bible translations. And now in English grammar, they're compulsory. So you just have to put them in, and you've eliminated the non-binary. Yeah, I mean non-binary in the grammatical sense, where something can be midway between a question and a statement. I was talking with a group earlier about Pontius Pilate's saying to Jesus, "You're the King of the Jews," and it's sort of half question, half statement, and Jesus said, "You just said so." In our translations, he says, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And Jesus just said, "You said so." Because we struggle with the idea of a non-binary utterance, the sort of raising of the eyebrow. You did that, So anyway, here we are, and we've got these two amazing warm-up stories that get you thinking before you get on to the main story, which is this story of these two sons. There was a man who had two sons. And what I want to show you is how brilliant this story is, how crafted it is, and how there is no fat on this. There is no word that I could take away without losing something. Jesus is the most brilliant storyteller ever. Man had two sons. Have we ever come across that before? Oh, yes, we have. We've come across it in Matthew chapter 21. There isn't a 31. Matthew chapter 21, where Jesus begins a completely different story. A man had two sons. Matthew 21, verse 28. What do you think? A man had two sons. He went to the first and said, "Son, go and work in the vineyard today." He answered, "I will not." But afterward, he changed his mind and went. He went to another son and said the same. And he answered, "I go, sir," but did not go. Which of the two did the will of the Father? They said to him, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, the tax collectors and prostitutes," which may give you an idea of the sinners in Luke 15, tax collectors and prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you. John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him, and even when you saw it, you did not afterwards change your mind to believe in him. What's so interesting about these two stories that both begin, a man had two sons, is firstly, we're seeing a hallmark of Jesus' storytelling. And there are other ones here where this is not a brilliant story written by Luke. This is a brilliant story told by Jesus. And it's got that same opening that we've got independently in a completely different story in Matthew, but that completely different story is making some of the same points. That the reversal, that the one who looked good, who said, "I'll go," no, and then went. The one who looked bad did the right thing. The one who looked good did not. There are all sorts of elements there where we can say it's got the style of Jesus. The younger of them said to his father, and what I want you to notice is the first word from his mouth. It's the word Father. And on all three occurrences that the younger son talks to his father, first to ask for the inheritance, secondly, he's rehearsing his speech in his head, but not actually delivering it, but third, when he actually delivers it, the first word out of his mouth is Father. In fact, he says the word Father 5 times in this story overall. One of the brilliant features of Jesus' storytelling is the way he omits words. Look at what's the first word from the older brother's mouth. It's look. It's the missing word. Jesus is able to do something by missing out a word. It's the dog that didn't bark, if you know the reference to Conan Doyle. And what you got is that here we have the younger son who looks like he's further away from the father is actually emotionally closer to the father. Look at the way the story uses near and far. The younger son goes into a far country. The father sees him afar off, but it's the older son who draws near. But the geographical distance is the polar opposite of the emotional distance. We're going to see that although this older son is physically close, he's actually emotionally far away. Father, give me the share that's coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Vital point there. That it's not in response that he just gives the inheritance to the younger son, he gives it to both. What country is this story taking place in? We don't know. It's a story. It doesn't have to take place in any particular country, but we know from Deuteronomy 21:17 that if it takes place under Old Testament law, the older brother gets double, and Jesus builds up a picture whereby you know at the end of the story that this is a farm, but he never slows down and wastes time to tell you it's a farm. So there's a really good storyteller is able to build pictures in your mind without using the specific word, okay? Now, you know the way inheritance generally happens with farms in all sorts of cultures is you can't split them into ever smaller plots as you go through the generations. Everyone knows that the younger son isn't going to inherit the farm. He's not going to inherit as much as the older son. The older son is going to do really well. Therefore, of course, we know that the older son is going to be so happy. He's going to love the little brother so much because he's just landed a jackpot. Oh, little brother, I love you so much. You asked Dad the tough question, and as a result, I got my inheritance early. Oh, little brother, you're so kind. I'll miss you if I ever go away. What can I do for you? Is there any way I can help? I am so glad you've made my life come. True, it's great. That's not how he feels, but you can imagine that's how he should feel, because this is a super generous father who gives his property between them. Now, there is, as far as we can understand, the legal convention that would take place, at least in Jewish society, whereby the father is still the head of the family, so he then cannot dispose of the capital, but he is still able to give commands like killing the fattened calf. So that's the sort of situation we have from then on. And then not many days later, it says the younger son gathered everything, the movable stuff, and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. Now, this is a brilliant part of Jesus' story, because he does everything with one word. Living, asotos is the Greek word. It's an alpha privative, negative plus word relating to salvation plus your adverb ending. That's it, just one word. All of that sin passed over with one word. When we retell the story, and when people retell the story in fiction, or they base fictional narratives off this, that word becomes the huge central section. If you were to make a film about this, you would make that into the main section, the sin. Jesus is a better storyteller than that. You're never better off after hearing a story of sin. You sometimes need to hear a story of sin so you can help someone and sympathize with them or whatever it is, but you're never actually built up by it. And sin is profoundly boring. If you were to specify his sins, one, you could risk glamorizing them. Two, you over-specify the story so that it becomes a story that only relates to particular people's circumstances. Jesus is a better storyteller than that, so he doesn't do that. So he then passes on, and it says that he wastes his money. There's so many ways of wasting money. And then it's gone. Now, the interesting thing there is, of course, he's telling a story about wasting money right next to another story about wasting money. Because look at chapter 16, verse 1. He also said to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager. Charges were brought against him that this man was wasting his possessions. So Jesus is telling two stories next to each other about people who waste money. How do you feel about people who waste money? You Doge supporters? That was silence. How do you feel about people who waste money generally? People who waste your money, you don't like that at all. And here Jesus is talking to Pharisees who hate their money being wasted. The emotion you feel when you see your money wasted is anger, okay? And shouldn't you feel righteous anger against this younger son who is wasting money that was built up by the father, and now it's just gone? And then it says, when he had spent everything, verse 14, a severe famine arose in that country. This is a brilliant aspect of Jesus' story that people ignore. In fact, Edmund Clowney, in his book on this story, talks about how a group in St. Petersburg, where there had been experience of famine, were more likely to notice that famine in the story than a group from the US. Because basically, this is a really key part of the story. We think of him as the story of the prodigal son. Why does he end up feeding pigs? Because he made bad decisions. But Jesus' version of the story is no. He ends up feeding pigs because he made bad decisions and was unlucky. He is the prodigal and unlucky son. He ends up feeding pigs because he happened to choose to go to the one country that happened to be hit by a multi-year famine, a severe famine. That's why he ends up feeding pigs. We never get the version where it's just he's feeding pigs from his own decisions. We don't know that. Now, as far as the older brother's concerned, he's in a difficult situation entirely because of what he's been doing. But that's not the story that Jesus tells. It just ever so slightly lets him off the hook, which is a really interesting thing, because we might be inclined to say that person is in that bad situation because they've made bad decisions. And actually what Jesus does is he actually adds this extra element. We may be in a good situation also because we had better luck. Now, I'm not talking in theological terms. You understand? I'm talking about in experiential terms. We just seem to have been dealt a better hand in life. And so what happens is he began to be in need. And notice the way Jesus uses this phrase, began to be in need, began to celebrate. It just stretches the thing out, okay? So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country. What a brilliant word choice there, because citizen really rubs in. I'm afraid the US has changed the way immigration's been done recently. There used to be a line that I used to enjoy joining called aliens. I thought, I love the idea. I'm an alien now. And so I sometimes ask the people, where can aliens go? But it does rub in. He doesn't belong. He's not a citizen. And so even that word choice is so absolutely key. Who send him into his fields, plural, to feed pigs. And there you have, of course, we know herding is the lowest job. That's why David's big brothers are happy for him to do herding. It's pretty lousy. But you add that, the uncleanness of pigs, and you see just how low he's brought. Now, psychologically, this is a brilliant move because Jesus has got the Pharisee audience on side. This story is going well. Here is someone who has dishonored his father, and now he is getting his comeuppance. So they are going to be emotionally on side before the story is going to turn around and become a lot more uncomfortable for them. And it said he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one was giving him anything. Now notice this. The phrase long to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, the phrase long to be filmed, comes up again in the next chapter because it's the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And there we have how we read that Lazarus longed to be filled with what fell from the rich man's table, but along came the dogs and licked his sores. Now think about that. Long to be filmed, the only two times that these phrases occur, adjacent chapters on the lips of Jesus, immediately followed, one by pigs, one by dogs. That's really interesting because that's the mind of Jesus, because over in Matthew and only in Matthew, Jesus says, don't throw your pearls to the swine, don't give what's holy to the dogs. And it's the same grouping of those same two unclean animals we can see in Matthew and only in Matthew and in Luke here. Because it's the same mind, because we are seeing so many hallmarks that these words come from Jesus. This brilliant story comes. And this is an interesting thing because brilliant stories don't get made up by committees like this. Like this, don't get made up by committees. So I don't think we could say that, well, Jesus said the core bit of the story, and then Luke and other people added on to that. The whole masterwork has to come, all 3 minutes of it, from Jesus. I hope you're going to be convinced of that by the end of tomorrow, that this is a massive argument for the integrity of what's been handed on to us. Now, he's giving the pods and things to the pigs, and no one is giving him anything. So his job is not a job with any pay. He's not even getting pig reject food. He's getting no food. And therefore he's on the path to die. And it's only when he's on that path that he wakes up, that he comes to himself. And then Jesus allows us inside this man's mind. For 2 whole verses, we have a soliloquy. He addresses himself. Just as in chapter 16, with the parable of the unjust steward, we're going to find he self-addresses for 2 verses. It's exactly the same storytelling technique across these different stories. And he thinks about how generous his father is. And this is an encouraging thing for anyone whose children have gone astray, that sort of memory that they have of the love at home. Such a strong thing. That his father pays the hired servants more than the going rates. And here he is perishing with hunger. I will arise and go to my father. I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven before you, no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired servants. And he goes back, and the entire return is done in half a verse. But while he's still a long way off, his father sees him. Why does his father see him? The storyteller never tells us. So let's think of some scenarios. What about this? The father usually didn't look out of the window, but he just happened to look out this once. It seems improbable. So we start building a sense, although Jesus never tells us this, that the father was constantly looking out. And this is a brilliant aspect of storytelling. There are things that are explicit, and there are things that are implicit, and there are things that we are likely to conclude. And so Jesus tells that story in that very powerful way, where he doesn't actually make an explicit statement that the father always used to look out the window, but we conclude that that's probably the case. We know from the rest of the story that there are lots of other people, hired servants, whole load of people at the party, there's an older brother, all sorts of people could have seen him return, but it's only the father who does see him return. And then what we see is that he saw him, and his reaction is not the emotion we expect. We should expect anger because he's seeing someone who went off with such a lot who is now returning with nothing. He has wasted his money. We know that we're angry at people who waste our money, but he feels compassion, and he runs and embraces him and kisses him. And the son begins this speech. But we also see there's a difference between the speech he's prepared in his head and the speech he actually delivers. He's prepared a bit in his head, which had the final line, make me like one of your hired servants, but he doesn't get to do that. And the storyteller never tells us why he doesn't get to do that, so we have to work that out. And the most readers come to the conclusion that the father has interrupted him. But the storyteller was never so crass as to say the father interrupted him. He just gets on with it. The father, and literally the first word from the father's mouth is quick. Time has been moving so slowly for years, and now there is no time to waste. And the father never speaks to the younger son in this story. Notice that. The first words are to the servants, who have clearly caught up with the father, but the storyteller never slowed down one moment to tell us that they'd caught up. Okay? He's just getting on. That's why there's an economy of words that is extraordinary in this storytelling method. Quick, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And you see how emotional the father is in this. And also how the first 62% is about the younger son, and it ends with these words. Dead and alive again, lost and found. The final 38% about the older son end with the same phrase, but with a difference. Because whereas section 1 is this, my son was dead and alive again, section 2 is this, your brother was dead and alive again. But let's go on to the second section. The older son was in the field. What was he doing in the field? The storyteller doesn't tell us. So we're going to try and work that out. We have to work that out. What's he doing? Well, he could be just wandering around the field, couldn't we? But we guess he's not. I think most of us deduce that he seems to be working late. In fact, he's working late when other people have clocked off. Maybe he's left his cell phone behind. People can't get to him. Maybe he's a long way away. But there he is. He's working in the field. He's connected with the field, and he comes and he draws near to the house. We'll think about that word more tomorrow. He heard music and dancing, which can be very happy or incredibly annoying. You're trying to get to sleep and there are people, music and dancing in the room above you or whatever it is. It's an incredible thing. And he calls one of the servants or lads. There's a question about whether that's a servant or just a young bystander. And he asks what these things meant. And then what we see is a brilliant verse 27. Verse 27 is one of the most brilliant verses in this whole story, because I want to read it with a bored voice, okay? The guy says to him, your brother has come and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. I want you to notice there is no emotion in this verse. It is pure fact. okay? The disinterested bystander. As far as they're concerned, when they report it, it's very different from how Dad sees it. Dad sees it as dead and alive again, which is not factually correct, but it's emotionally very powerful, right? This bystander, he is fine. He is in good health. That is why there is a meat feast. You see, it's a different way of seeing things. And what's so interesting is that this storyteller, Jesus, is able to turn emotions off and on. So there's a huge emotional intelligence as well as intellectual intelligence we're going to see over these 2 days. Because what he does is he contrasts that least emotional verse 27 with the most emotional verse from the older brother's reaction, namely verse 28. Verse 28, we see the older brother was angry. And he refused to go in. So his father comes out and entreats him. And he answered his father, look. That absence of the word father. And it never tells you that this is the first time he's had an outburst of anger. But you are absolutely sure that this anger has been pent up inside him. And is now, the dam is just released. And it all flows out. So you have this sense, you build up, the psychological build up of the story is so incredible, that he's able to give you this sense of someone who's been keeping the rules, at least in his own mind, and suddenly he's angry with his father. Look, all these years, literally, I have slaved for you. That's interesting. He's been actually working on a farm that he himself owns. If the farm gets more prosperous, he is personally more prosperous. But though he is a son and he owns the farm, he sees himself as a slave. And that he's been slaving for his dad. And then he uses, I never disobeyed your command, and you never gave me a young goat. So 2 nevers, which the father will respond to with an always. Just the beauty of these words here. He talks as if his father is going around giving commands. But we know the father overpays the hired servants, gives both his sons the inheritance early. He seems to be super generous. So we also see a sort of cynical attitude in this older son, that he is seeing his dad as mean, who never gave me a young goat. The vegetarian farm. Yes, we know that. Not allowed to eat meat. Dude, he gave you every goat on the farm. You never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate my friends. Now, let's think about that idea. It's not plausible that it's a vegetarian farm. It's not plausible that the dad said no more goat eating. And anyway, even if he had, son owns the goats. Has son been eating with dad? Yes. Has he been able to have friends round? Well, we can't really believe that the father who gives his inheritance early to both sons and welcomes younger son and, is overpays his hired servants, bans friends from coming round. That's not plausible. So the only possible interpretation of this is that the son is not happy because dad is there. You see, he can't enjoy goat meat with dad and friends there. He needs to have dad away. Some people say that the younger son was being so rude when he asked for his inheritance that it was like he wanted his father dead. I disagree with that common interpretation, but I may be wrong. I think that the younger son wanted the inheritance. I think the older son wanted his father dead. And he's there all the time, and he is resenting his father. And I never disobeyed your command. You never gave me a young goat that I would celebrate with my friends. And notice how he's wanting this measly celebration with goat and his friends when his dad has put a calf on, which is so much better. But when this son of yours, and notice how he denies that his brother is his brother. He's denying that kinship, Cain. Who has devoured your property with prostitutes? How do you know? You are just in from the field. You haven't spoken to anyone. How do you know your little brother's biggest expense has been prostitutes? Jesus precisely does not tell us what he wasted his money on. It could have been that, but we don't know. So there's only one source of information that's possible, because little brother has not been sending postcards from the brothel, because little brother has been dead. He's been off the radar. Therefore, the only possible source of information is the imagination. Why is he imagining that his little brother is doing that? And also at the same time, we note that he's resenting his father being around. That's really suggestive. Look in the mirror. It looks to me that really that's the sort of thing he would have wanted to be doing. That's why he's projecting it onto his brother. You killed the fattened calf for him. Fattened calf has 400 or 500 portions of meat. I don't think he's going to manage that all himself. So he says to him, son, child. And this is exactly the same word, by the way, that Abraham says to the man who had been rich. I have to call him the temporarily rich man and Lazarus, because he's never called rich after he gets to Hades. He can't take it with him. But it's exactly the same way that Father Abraham talks to him. He said, it was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And what's so interesting here is that it leaves that open question. How is this older brother going to respond? But also, it is fitting is a phrase that we're going to find elsewhere at the end of Jesus's stories. We find it in Matthew chapter 18. It was fitting to forgive. When it's a parable of the unforgiving servant. It's exactly the same thing. The words that begin this story, the words that end this story, are Jesus-type words as attested elsewhere. So again, building the case that Jesus really does say all of these things. And as we look at this story, it is remarkable how it fits together, but also how there are lots and lots of links with the nearby stories. Just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about that. So in the following section, chapter 16, we have these two stories. One of they're both about rich men, actually. There's a rich man with a steward who wastes his money. Then we got a rich man and Lazarus. And you're going to find a lot of the same sort of things happen. For instance, in the story of the temporarily rich man and Lazarus, the rich man is saying, Father Abraham, 3 times Father, just as we have the address of this story here. Or, how many of my father's hired servants? That word, how many, is exactly the same phrase as how much we get in the story of the unjust steward in chapter 16. The same sorts of things that we do. Or the word quickly, do this. Unjust steward story is sit down quickly and write. So we find these same themes showing that clearly whoever tells the story of Luke 15 and 16 has to be the same person. Go over to Luke 16 and you also see a bit more about this person. Namely, that he knows certain phrases. We can just look at them in Luke 16, where the type of oil that's been, the measures of oil, they're in verse 6, and the measures of wheat are the core and the bath, okay? And those are specific to the land of Jesus. The phrase sons of righteousness used in sons of unrighteousness and unrighteous mammon, sons of light and unrighteous mammon, again, specifically Palestinian phrases. In other words, we build up a picture of who the speaker is, and this is going to be an important argument. It's not Luke making these stories up. This is someone who comes from the land of Jesus, who speaks the way that Jesus is elsewhere attested to speak, who clearly, as we're going to see tomorrow, knows the Old Testament fantastically well and could be no one other than Jesus. Now, what does Jesus' story say? The first 62% is so much showing you that if you're an outsider, how welcome you are, how the Father is willing to welcome you, whatever you've done. You're a tax collector, you're a sinner, come and you will be welcomed Immediately, fully, there's no probation. But there's such a challenge to those who might see themselves as insiders, like that older son, like the scribes and the Pharisees. If they are going to experience the celebration, they have to accept that tax collectors and sinners can be their siblings. And so this is how Jesus' story works on the surface. Tomorrow we're going to start going deep with this story, and well, I look forward to that. But thank you very much for listening.